Beneath the smoke of a war that never ended lies a silence more dangerous than gunfire. Locked doors in forgotten archives guard fragments of truths too volatile for daylight, blueprints of vanished machines, coded whispers of impossible weapons, shadows of armies that never officially marched. These are not stories of victory or defeat, but of secrets smothered before they could breathe. What remains are only echoes, buried in files meant never to be opened. In the final weeks of April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the advancing Soviet armies, reports emerged from Allied reconnaissance flights that hinted at an anomaly buried deep within the chaos of Berlin. Intelligence officers operating under the designation Operation Eclipse, the codename for Britain's plan to seize the German capital, filed a series of urgent memos between April 22nd and April 28th describing unusual construction activity in the heavily wooded Grunewald district. The documents, found decades later in the Air Ministry's sealed archives, referred not to defensive bunkers or flak towers, but to narrow, camouflaged strips of tarmac. These strips, the memo stated, bore the unmistakable dimensions of improvised runways. At the time, the Luftwaffe was a shattered force. Its squadrons had been bled dry by years of attrition, its pilots inexperienced, and its aircraft factories pulverized by Allied bombing. Yet these runways suggested preparation for something new, something desperate. A decrypted intercept from the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL, to units stationed near Potsdam mentioned emergency deployment of Girat 271, all operational assets to be transferred west at dusk. Girat 271 has never been conclusively identified, but post-war speculation placed it among the late-war experimental bomber projects, the Arado R-234 jet bomber, or the advanced Junkers EF-140 prototypes. The documents hint that these hidden strips could have served as dispersal points for jet-powered aircraft capable of reaching London in under an hour. Allied reconnaissance photographs, later released under the Freedom of Information Act in 1996, depict long scars in the Grunewald forest floor, each lined with what appear to be crude hangar structures constructed from prefabricated steel. They are blurred, almost deliberately obscured by overlapping tree cover, as if camouflaged from the air. One set of notes penned by Wing Commander R.H. Dyson of RAF Photographic Reconnaissance reads, "Possible forward jet deployment, camouflaged. Activity exceeds known Luftwaffe capacity in sector. Recommend immediate strike." Yet no strike was ordered. With Berlin already burning under Soviet artillery, Allied High Command apparently decided the Soviet advance would overrun the site. Soon enough, what followed is more elusive. Soviet ground reports dated April 30th, just hours before Hitler's suicide in the Führerbunker, mention fierce skirmishes in the Grunewald between Red Army scouts of the 47th Army and SS units with mechanized support. Eyewitnesses describe convoys of trucks moving under cover of darkness, their headlights extinguished, escorted by half-tracks bearing Waffen-SS insignia. Several Soviet patrols reported hearing the distinctive whine of jet turbines echoing through the forest night, though no wreckage of Arado or Messerschmitt jets was ever documented on site. After the war, US Army intelligence officers of the Technical Intelligence Service scoured the area. Their reports noted extensive signs of demolition, including burned-out hangar skeletons, cratered strips, and buried crates containing only scorched documentation. A single fragment recovered from the ruins bore the stamp of Luftflotte Reich and a partially legible heading, Flugplatzanlage Berlin Projekt Morgenrot. Project Morgenrot, Red Dawn, has never been explained in surviving German records. The Soviets, meanwhile, claim to have seized all relevant material. In 1952, a defector from the Soviet Air Force, Major Viktor Slobodin, testified in West Berlin that he had seen captured German jet prototypes at a secret facility near Moscow, flown there from Berlin in early May 1945. His testimony was largely dismissed in the West at the time, regarded as Cold War exaggeration. But an internal CIA memorandum from 1953, document reference CIA AE 41209, acknowledged that a number of late-model German jet designs were successfully recovered by Soviet Forces in the Berlin sector, exact origin unspecified. The most chilling clue appears in a British Joint Intelligence Committee report from September 1945, stamped Most Secret. The report speculates that the Grunewald strips were not intended for operational missions against London at all, but for emergency evacuation. The intended payload, not bombs, but personnel and documents. Among the names listed as possibly evacuated was Dr. Walter Dornberger, the Wehrmacht general overseeing Germany's rocket program. While Dornberger was ultimately captured by US forces in May 1945, the fact that his name appeared in this context raises questions about whether other high-value scientists escaped under similar cover. To this day, no definitive evidence confirms the purpose of the hidden airfields. The forest scars were gradually reclaimed by nature, and the few remaining hangar ruins were demolished by Soviet engineers during the early 1950s. Local residents, however, remembered the nights of April 1945 with haunting clarity. One diary, recovered from a Charlottenburg resident in 1947, describes columns of smoke rising from the woods and the sound of planes rushing low over the rooftops without lights. The British and Americans never admitted to finding operational aircraft at the site. The Soviets maintained silence, refusing to acknowledge even the existence of the Grunewald runways in official publications. Yet the scattered fragments, blurred, reconnaissance photos, burned documents, and witness accounts paint a picture of a desperate last gamble. Whether the airfields launched a final attempt to prolong the war or merely served as a cover for the evacuation of men and secrets remains unanswered. Operation Eclipse officially referred only to the Allied plan for the occupation of Germany, but within the intelligence community, the name took on a darker connotation, the eclipse of truth beneath layers of secrecy. For the forest of Grunewald, with its hidden runways and vanishing squadrons, became one of many shadows cast by the dying Reich, where facts were buried as carefully as the concrete strips beneath the pines. By the time the Cold War fully entrenched Europe in division, the Grunewald mystery was all but forgotten, overshadowed by Berlin's more visible scars, the wall, the airlift, and the ruin of the Reichstag. Yet within classified circles, the question persisted: what exactly departed from Berlin under the cover of darkness in those final April nights? Some argued it was merely scorched earth tactics. Others whispered that it was knowledge, jet engines, guidance systems, or worse, that would reappear not in Germany, but in the research programs of the superpowers that carved the world into East and West. Nearly 8 decades later, the file on Operation Eclipse remains a stark reminder. In war's final hours, silence and smoke conceal as much as rubble and ruin, and among the ruins of Berlin, not every runway led to surrender. Between 1941 and 1944, the Arctic convoys that sailed from Britain and Iceland to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were considered among the most dangerous missions of the Second World War. Crews battled not only German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers, but also ice storms, polar night, and the crushing pressure of pack ice. Yet even amidst this crucible of hardship, a pattern emerged that intelligence officers struggled to explain. Entire merchant ships vanished without trace, even in areas where enemy activity had been ruled out. Convoy PQ-17, the infamous disaster of July 1942, is often remembered for its decimation by German aircraft and submarines. But lesser-known records from PQ-13 in March 1942 and JW-55B in December 1943 tell of vessels that broke formation, reporting navigational errors or mysterious interference, only to disappear. One such ship, the SS Horace Grey, transmitted a final garbled signal, bearing off, signals compromised. She never reached port. Post-war reports would describe this as likely mechanical failure, though no debris or bodies were ever recovered. The Admiralty's files, sealed under the designation ADM 223-1947 and declassified only in the late 1980s, reveal a far stranger possibility. Among intercepted Enigma messages captured by Bletchley Park's Hut 8 were references to Gerate Nereus. The codename appears in fragmented naval traffic between Kriegsmarine Command in Kiel and a testing detachment near Narvik. One translation reads, Nereus deployed with satisfactory concealment effect. Test convoy unaware. Analysts at the time could not interpret the phrase, though naval intelligence suspected an acoustic countermeasure of some kind. The Barents Sea was a laboratory of desperation. By 1943, the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet was losing effectiveness in the Atlantic. Engineers at the Torpedoversuchsanstalt, torpedo research establishment in Eckenförde, experimented with sonar jamming and acoustic deception devices, many of them under codenames borrowed from mythology, Nyx, Triton, and apparently Nereus. Reports captured by Allied forces at Trondheim after the German surrender included diagrams of low-frequency emitters mounted on buoys, designed to project false sound signatures. The principle was simple: trick Allied sonar into perceiving phantom escorts or entire convoys while steering real vessels into mined waters or U-boat traps. If Nereus was deployed in the Arctic, it may explain the anomalous losses. One particularly damning entry appears in the logbook of HMS Offa, an escort destroyer assigned to Convoy PQ-18 in September 1942. On September 14th, her ASDIC operators detected a massive contact directly ahead, suggesting a cruiser-sized vessel. The convoy altered course sharply east, only to find no ship present. Hours later, the Liberty ship Mary Luckenbach struck a mine and exploded, killing all aboard. The entry was flagged in Admiralty correspondence, though the possibility of enemy deception was dismissed at the time as faulty sonar return. Soviet records from Murmansk, preserved in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, TSAMO, provide another thread. A report dated March 1944 from Captain V.N. Grishin, commander of a Soviet minesweeping flotilla, describes intercepting strange buoyed devices emitting rhythmic pulses. Several were recovered and shipped to Moscow. The devices vanished from official inventory soon after, with no further mention in Soviet naval bulletins. Western analysts later speculated these could have been prototypes of Nereus. By 1945, the Arctic convoys had ceased, and with victory declared, the mystery of the vanished ships was buried under layers of official explanation. Families of lost. Sailors were told their vessels succumbed to weather or U-boat attack. But a small cadre of intelligence officers continued to press the issue. A memorandum by Rear Admiral Geoffrey Miles, filed in January 1946, stated, "We must consider the possibility that several ships were not destroyed by conventional attack, but lured deliberately into destruction by acoustic deception. If such devices exist, we must assume the Russians now hold them." The file was stamped secret and shelved. During the Cold War, the spectre of Nereus resurfaced. In 1961, a NATO naval exercise in the Norwegian Sea reported interference eerily similar to the wartime incidents. Phantom sonar returns, bearings that shifted without explanation, and false echoes that led frigates into hazardous shallows. A British intelligence report suggested that the Soviets may have re-engineered the Nereus technology. The parallels with the Arctic convoys of 20 years earlier were noted but never acknowledged publicly. What makes the Arctic convoy Enigma chilling is not simply the disappearance of ships, but the erasure of records. Admiralty logs omit names of certain vessels. Convoy reports were rewritten to exclude unexplained navigational anomalies. Families pressed for answers, but official inquests produced nothing beyond boilerplate references to fog, ice, and enemy action. When portions of the ADM-223 file surfaced in the 1980s, researchers found entire pages missing, with handwritten notations. Removed per agreement, 1952. Agreement with whom remains unclear. Historians today tread carefully around the subject. Some argue that Nereus was nothing more than an experimental sonar buoy, unproven and irrelevant to actual convoy losses. Others insist the pattern is too precise: ships drawn off course, sudden disappearance, and lack of wreckage. If the device existed, it represented not just a technological breakthrough, but a psychological weapon, convincing sailors to doubt the reliability of their own instruments in an environment where trust in sonar was life or death. Survivors of the convoys interviewed in the 1970s often recalled the dread of ghost contacts in the polar seas. One British seaman interviewed anonymously said, "We would hear the pings on the set, strong, clear, impossible to ignore. But when we looked, there was nothing but black water and ice. The next morning, another ship would be gone." His testimony mirrors dozens of similar accounts buried in oral history projects. Whether or not Nereus was responsible, the Arctic convoy Enigma lingers as one of the least explained anomalies of the Second World War. In the official histories, the EZE missing ships are listed as losses to weather, accident, or enemy action. Yet in the unredacted margins of forgotten files, another story emerges, one of acoustic shadows, engineered illusions, and a war fought not only with torpedoes and bombs, but with silence and deception beneath the frozen seas. If Nereus truly functioned as intended, it suggests that the Battle of the Atlantic and Arctic was not merely a duel of submarines and convoys, but the first battlefield of electronic warfare, where the boundary between what sailors heard and what was real could mean the difference between survival and obliteration. The convoys delivered their vital cargoes to the Soviet Union, ensuring the Eastern Front did not collapse. But the price, measured in vanished ships and unanswered questions, remains frozen in the archives, sealed under the cold waters of the Barents Sea. On the night of March 21, 1945, Soviet assault groups of the First Belarusian Front crossed the Oder River near Kustrin, establishing bridgeheads in preparation for the drive on Berlin. By this stage, the Wehrmacht was collapsing on all fronts. Yet Soviet situation reports began to reference encounters with a unit that should not have existed, the 23rd Panzer Division. No official German order of battle for March 1945 lists such a formation. The last recognized panzer divisions were the 21st, which had been destroyed in Normandy, and the 25th, shattered in Hungary. Still, in multiple combat diaries preserved in the Russian Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, SAMO, Soviet tank commanders recorded attacks by German armored columns with unusual characteristics. Major Ivan Rudenkov of the 44th Guards Tank Brigade wrote on March 23rd, "Enemy tanks, black in color, without insignia, struck our rear echelon at dawn. Vehicles appeared new, with high speed, not typical of Panthers or T-4. This was not an isolated report. Over the following week, at least 5 Soviet rifle divisions noted similar incidents. Sudden attacks by unidentified armored units, followed by equally sudden withdrawals into the Oder marshes. Prisoners captured in these clashes claimed they belonged to 23 Panzer Division, though none could provide a commanding officer's name. Their uniforms bore no divisional insignia, only plain black patches where emblems should have been. NKVD interrogation notes described the prisoners as nervous, evasive, uncooperative, with many refusing to state their hometowns. Several were later transferred to Moscow for further examination. Western records mirror this anomaly. After the war, US Army intelligence teams scouring German archives in Flensburg found no mention of a 23rd Panzer Division. Yet in May 1945, during the Nuremberg interrogations, General Walter Wenck, former commander of the 12th Army, admitted under questioning, "Yes, there was a unit operating on the Oder that we did not control. They were not in our reports. They came and went. I assumed Himmler had something to do with them." Theories proliferated in the post-war years. One points to remnants of shattered panzer divisions, reorganized under SS command as ad hoc Kampfgruppen. But the uniform reports of black-painted tanks stand out. Survivors described vehicles resembling Panthers, yet stripped of all markings and painted in a matte finish that absorbed moonlight. In one Soviet account, the tanks advanced without headlamps, guided only by faint signal lights, suggesting training and equipment beyond that of improvised militia. A British intelligence summary dated October 1946, WO 208-4563, reviewed Soviet claims of the 23rd Panzer Division. The report concluded, possibly elements of the Panzer Division Clausewitz, or fragments of the SS Nordland Division operating under cover. However, consistency of accounts concerning vehicle coloration and insignia absence suggests a deliberate policy of anonymity. The British officer who authored the report underlined a chilling line in red pencil. Could indicate Himmler's creation of a clandestine armoured reserve for evacuation or special missions. Physical evidence proved elusive. No tanks matching the black description were ever recovered on the Oder front. Photographs captured by Soviet war correspondents show wrecked panzers near Kustrin, but none display the uniform black coating described in field reports. Yet, an unusual entry in the inventory of the Red Army's 2nd Guards Tank Army lists 2 captured German tanks labelled only unknown type, black coloration, destroyed before transport. The file ends abruptly with the note, forwarded to Moscow, 4th April 1945. What became of these machines is unknown. In East German archives opened after 1990, researchers found references to the so-called Schatten Division, the Shadow Division, mentioned in post-war Soviet training manuals as an example of fascist deception tactics. The manuals claimed the unit was composed of hardened SS veterans tasked with harassing advancing armies and buying time for Nazi leadership evacuations. Whether this was genuine intelligence or propaganda is uncertain, but the consistency of eyewitness reports across Soviet and Western files cannot be easily dismissed. Perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from civilians. Residents of Kustrin reported seeing columns of armoured vehicles moving at night, accompanied by trucks and motorcycles, heading westward into the forests. One villager later recalled, "They did not stop. No markings, no flags, only black steel. They passed like shadows." By April 1945, such sightings ceased. When historians revisited the issue in the 1970s, many dismissed the 23rd Panzer Division as a phantom born of confusion in chaotic battle. The German historian Karl-Heinz Frieser argued it was a Soviet SAW. Misidentification of ad hoc units cobbled together from training schools and stragglers. But countering this are the multiple, independent reports of unmarked black tanks noted by officers who had fought and destroyed dozens of legitimate German divisions before. These were experienced men, unlikely to misidentify what they saw. Cold War analysts suspected another possibility, that the 23rd Panzer was not intended for combat in the traditional sense, but for specific missions of delay, destruction, and evacuation. Intelligence memos reference the possibility that sensitive documents or personnel were moved west under their cover, with the anonymous tanks buying precious hours. Indeed, certain high-ranking Nazi officials, including engineers from the Reich's weapons programs, vanished from Berlin before the Soviet encirclement. Whether their escape was aided by the Ghost Division remains speculation. The legacy of the 23rd Panzer Division is one of silence and erasure. Unlike other formations, no surviving war diaries, organizational charts, or award rolls exist. No commanding officer's name was ever confirmed. No insignia, banners, or regimental standards were captured. What remains are fragments: a Soviet report, a British memo, a prisoner's cryptic statement, and the memory of tanks painted black rolling through the forests of Brandenburg. In war, confusion often creates myths, but in this case, the myth is backed by enough official documentation to suggest something tangible: an armoured ghost force that appeared at the war's end and then vanished without a trace. Whether they were SS fanatics, experimental units, or simply an elaborate deception, their presence on the Oder remains a riddle preserved in the margins of classified files. For the men of the Red Army who faced them, the 23rd Panzer was real enough, deadly, elusive, and gone as quickly as it came. In the ruins of Kustrin, where the Oder still flows, the question lingers: who commanded the Ghost Division, and what was their true mission in the dying days of the Reich? By 1942, The Portuguese capital of Lisbon had become one of the strangest crossroads of the Second World War. Officially neutral under Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's Estado Novo regime, the city was alive with agents, informants, and smugglers. Every café along the Avenida da Liberdade seemed to buzz with whispers in German, English, Spanish, and Russian. It was here, in the middle of war-torn Europe, yet untouched by bombing, that the Allies and Axis tested the boundaries of diplomacy, espionage, and survival. British MI6, German Abwehr, and the newly formed American OSS each maintained large contingents in Lisbon, using the city's neutrality as cover. Ships left from the port of Lisbon for New York and Rio de Janeiro, making it one of the few remaining air and sea bridges to the wider world. Refugees queued for visas alongside arms dealers and informants. And somewhere beneath this chaos, a parallel operation stirred, an operation referred to in recently declassified US cables as Project Black Lantern. The surviving fragments of Project Black Lantern, uncovered in National Archives files labeled OSS-L 1944-BL, describe a clandestine program to monitor high-level negotiations between Nazi officials and intermediaries in Spain and Portugal. While the Allies publicly demanded unconditional surrender, the documents suggest that elements within the Reich sought channels to secure safe passage for assets, personnel, documents, and most chillingly, materials. One of the most tantalizing reports comes from February 1944. An OSS field officer operating under diplomatic cover recorded a meeting in Lisbon's Café Chaveduro between Spanish industrialist Juan March and a German envoy identified only as Dr. K. The report describes coded discussion of barrels of mineral substance being transferred through the port of Setúbal. The barrels, according to the cable, were destined for a freighter registered under Panamanian colors. No official Allied intelligence summaries acknowledge this transfer, yet a parallel British Naval Intelligence Division note, stamped secret, and dated March 1, 1944, refers cryptically to unaccounted uranium oxide movements via Portuguese ports. Portugal was not only a crossroads for refugees, it was a trading hub for wolfram, tungsten, essential for armor-piercing shells. Both Germany and the Allies competed fiercely for access to Portugal's mines. But uranium oxide was a different matter. If even a fraction of the rumors contained in the Black Lantern files were true, shipments of uranium ore could have passed unnoticed, their significance realized only later as nuclear research accelerated. The Abwehr was deeply entrenched. In Lisbon, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris had long cultivated contacts there, relying on neutral Portugal as a staging ground for messages to Spain and Latin America. Yet Canaris himself was executed in April 1945 for treason, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. Some historians argue that his network may have been hijacked by SS intelligence in the war's final years, using Lisbon not only as a listening post, but as an escape hatch. MI6 officers stationed in the British Embassy kept meticulous records of Lisbon's shadow games. Declassified reports describe cafes where British agents would sit within earshot of German attachés, exchanging false rumors designed to flush out spies. Yet some files are curiously blank. One folder, marked Lisbon Station, April 1944 Fawn, contains only a cover sheet, certain pages withdrawn in 1956. The missing content is rumored to have detailed clandestine meetings between Nazi agents and representatives of neutral shipping companies, negotiating routes for special cargo. Local police archives in Lisbon offer an additional clue. In the Polícia de Vigilância e Defesa do Estado (PVDE) files, there is a report dated June 1944 about a raid on a warehouse near the Tagus River. Inside were found crates labeled in German, containing radio equipment and falsified passports. Witnesses reported trucks moving barrels at night, loaded onto barges bound for larger vessels offshore. The PVDE transferred the matter to Salazar's government, and all documentation ceased. Project Black Lantern's final surviving cable, dated July 1944, paints a haunting picture. It states, "Reliable source, indicates high-value transfers. Complete. Contact notes Reich officials satisfied with arrangements. Strong suggestion that Lisbon remains primary node for extraction. The cable ends with a warning. Further inquiry risks compromise of diplomatic relations with Portugal. Recommend closure of investigation. When the war ended, Lisbon's role in the shadow conflict faded into obscurity. Official Allied histories emphasize the city's part in humanitarian rescue, highlighting the thousands of refugees who escaped Europe through Portugal. The darker story, the secret shipments, the coded negotiations, the silent movements through Setúbal, was quietly buried. During the Cold War, whispers of Lisbon's wartime secrets resurfaced. In 1958, a CIA memorandum noted, Soviet acquisition of uranium stockpiles may trace to wartime transfers via Iberian Peninsula. The memo referenced earlier OSS Black Lantern files, but concluded, evidence inconclusive, politically sensitive. In other words, the past was too dangerous to revisit. Today, historians sift through fragments, declassified OSS cables, withdrawn MI6 files, and half-burned police reports. The picture that emerges is of a city where neutrality was a facade and where Lisbon functioned as a diplomatic stage, a smuggler's port, and an espionage marketplace all at once. It is possible, though not provable, that some of the most consequential transfers of the war occurred not on battlefields, but in hushed meetings over coffee, or in barrels rolled onto ships under neutral flags. The shadow network of Lisbon remains, an unfinished story, a puzzle missing its final pieces. Did Nazi officials secure safe passage for critical technology through Portugal? Did the Allies know and quietly allow it in exchange for post-war advantages? Or was it all smoke, disinformation designed to conceal more mundane transactions? What is certain is that in Lisbon, neutrality was not silence. It was a cover, a stage upon which the hidden war played out. And in the cables of Project Black Lantern, we glimpse not answers, but shadows, hints of movements and meetings whose true consequences were erased long before the files were opened. For Lisbon was more than a neutral capital. It was the war's great waiting room, where secrets crossed borders as easily as ships sailed the Tagus into the Atlantic night. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast ended the Second World War. Within days, US occupation forces moved into Japan, determined to dismantle its war machine and uncover the truth behind its secret weapons programs. Among the most disturbing discoveries was Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's biological warfare division based in Pingfang, Manchuria. Commanded by General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 had conducted grotesque experiments on prisoners of war and civilians, testing plague, anthrax, and cholera on living subjects. Thousands perished in conditions that defied comprehension. Yet when US intelligence officers seized the archives of the unit in late 1945, not everything was accounted for. A whole set of files, labeled in surviving references as the Kodokan collection, simply vanished. Contemporary reports confirm that the US 5250th Technical Intelligence Company secured several crates of documents from the ruins of the Pingfang complex. These were flown to Tokyo in October 1945. An inventory list dated October 9th refers to medical experimentation logs, aerosol dispersal studies, subject mortality records, but a second list, attached as an annex, references a separate category: Kodokan collection, classified transmission protocols, European dispersal simulations. Those files do not appear in any subsequent catalogue. When American prosecutors prepared evidence for the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, no mention of aerosolized plague testing in simulated European conditions was presented. Declassified. CIA memoranda from the early Cold War hint at the fate of the missing material. A 1947 memo marked top secret, later released under FOIA, states, certain biological warfare files, Kodokan classification, were extracted from Tokyo prior to tribunal submission. Material incorporated into Fort Detrick program under restricted access. Fort Detrick in Maryland was, at the time, the hub of America's own biological weapons research. The memo suggests that rather than prosecuting Unit 731's leaders for war crimes, US authorities struck a bargain: immunity in exchange for data. General Ishii himself was never tried, living quietly in Japan until his death in 1959. The Soviets took a different approach. In December 1949, the USSR staged its own tribunal in Khabarovsk, where captured Unit 731 officers testified about biological warfare experiments. Their statements referenced aerosol testing, though none mentioned the Kodokan files directly. Still, Soviet intelligence insisted that the Americans had suppressed the most valuable data for their own use. A Soviet Ministry of Defense report from 1950 claimed, US acquisition of plague aerosol dispersal protocols from Kodokan archives confirmed by multiple sources, data being applied in Western biological laboratories. Evidence of the missing. Collection surfaces sporadically in post-war documents. A 1952 US Army Chemical Corps report, long since declassified, discusses urban dispersal models derived from foreign medical archives. Though it does not name Unit 731, the language mirrors the descriptions in the Lost Annex. Another telling detail lies in a 1956 Rand Corporation study on civilian vulnerability to aerosol attack, which footnotes Japanese field research, 1943-1945, source undisclosed. The phrasing suggests reliance on data unavailable through any published or captured record. The Japanese themselves had little access to these archives. Post-war investigators from the Japanese Ministry of Health were stonewalled by American occupation authorities. Requests for information about plague experiments in Manchuria were denied. Families of Unit 731 victims in China received no answers, as official trials omitted the evidence. The narrative presented at Tokyo focused on conventional war crimes, leaving the darkest aspects of Japan's biological warfare buried. By the 1970s, researchers began to uncover fragments of the truth. Historian Keiichi Tsuneshi interviewed former Unit 731 staff who spoke of files labeled with the word Kodokan, stored separately from routine experiment logs. One recalled, they contained instructions for air dispersal, not local field tests. They simulated towns with European structures. Another added, we knew the data was special. It was meant for bargaining if Japan lost. These testimonies aligned with US documents that quietly acknowledged a separate cache. What made the Kodokan collection so valuable was not simply its record of atrocities, but its perceived military utility. Unlike standard medical logs, these files allegedly described successful attempts to aerosolize plague bacteria for delivery by aircraft, including dispersal over mock towns built in Manchuria to resemble European cities. Photographs, never released, publicly supposedly showed mannequins placed in streets and homes to measure bacterial penetration. Mortality rates among captive subjects were meticulously recorded, along with wind direction, temperature, and infection spread. If true, the Kodokan files would have been of immense interest to both the US and Soviet Union at the dawn of the Cold War. Biological weapons were seen as a possible counterbalance to nuclear arms, and the ability to infect urban centers via aircraft dispersal was considered a strategic equalizer. Possession of such data would explain why the files disappeared into classified vaults rather than war crimes tribunals. In 1982, a declassified US Army inventory revealed that several foreign-origin biological archives were held in restricted Fort Detrick storage under accession numbers 731K. When Japanese journalists pressed for clarification, the Pentagon declined to comment. Meanwhile, Chinese officials repeatedly demanded the release of Unit 731 evidence, citing the vanished files as proof of Western complicity in concealing war crimes. The legacy of the missing collection is twofold. First, it represents one of the clearest examples of justice traded for information in the aftermath of war. Second, it shows how quickly the battle against fascism bled into the geopolitical competition of the Cold War, where atrocities became bargaining chips. Victims of Unit 731 were erased from the historical record, their suffering converted into data points for superpower laboratories. Today, researchers continue to pursue the trail of the vanished Kodokan files. Some argue they were destroyed to hide evidence of crimes. Others believe they remain locked in secure archives in the United States or Russia. Either way, their absence leaves a hole in the historical record, a silence where voices of the dead should have been heard. The story of Unit 731 is now widely known, its atrocities condemned by historians worldwide. But the fate of the Kodokan collection remains one of the Second World War's darkest archival mysteries. In a war defined by destruction, these papers survived, only to be buried by those who saw them not as evidence of crime, but as tools for the wars yet to come. History is a stage where the spotlight burns away what is convenient, leaving the shadows untouched. Behind every signed treaty and toppled monument, there lingers an unmarked trail of silence. Missions erased, experiments concealed, names spoken, only in corridors, without witnesses. To follow these trails is to step into the dark, where truth is fractured and certainty dissolves. The war ended in ruins, yet its ghosts still patrol the borders of the classified and the forgotten.